I was kidnapped by a Colombian guerrilla group and spent 6 months captive deep within the Andean Forests. It was in the 90s, at the peak of Colombia's modern violence period, when illegal armed forces shared the country and ties with a booming drug-dealing industry, both highly financed in part by a widespread kidnap practice. The effect was so generalized that likely most anyone in Colombia old enough today can relate with a personal story, a family member or a close friend that was in some way or another touched directly by the violence during this period. It was a cool December day when my family was traveling by car from Bogotá City to our hometown in the northern part of the country, some 12 hours away. It was past Christmas, and in Colombia this meant carnival season. We were set to spend the remainder of the holiday, New Year's, and the subsequent weeks with the rest of our family and friends, celebrating on one of the multiple regional festivals that spawn all over the country during the first weeks of the year. I was 14 years old. Somewhere halfway, there was a roadblock into what seemed to be a military control point, only it was not military at all. Several armed men in full camouflage patrolled in broad daylight, stopping cars and questioning the occupants. Luck had it that it was me who was sitting on the left side of the vehicle, behind the driver's seat. So when, after a few seemingly routine questions, we were all asked to step out, it was me who followed my father to the left, towards the open landscape. Conversely, my mom and brother stepped out to the right, against a hard rock mountain wall. After a couple more trivial questions, the man, being at the driver's side of the car, pointed towards my father and me and said, quite blandly and matter-of-fact-like, "Okay, so, the two of you are now kidnapped." These few words, spoken so lightly, took a while to really sink in. I remember clearly looking up at my father, not quite sure what he'd make of such blunt news. After a couple of uneasy seconds, my father said firmly and calmly, "Okay, we'll go." Given the few instants the whole ordeal took, the weight of what was going on didn't really hit me at the moment. Rather than an abrupt crash, the process was more like a slow-motion blur. Without really saying goodbye to mom and brother, we obeyed the silent indications of the armed men to get off the road and step into the trees. Walking those few meters, we both looked back. Me in confusion, my dad sending strong visual cues of strength and support to my mother. She screamed, the voice lingering on the air until only a few paces in, when the thick Colombian flora swallowed us whole. We walked a few hundred meters into the forest and met a larger group of armed men. Leaders from both parties exchanged some whispers, and then we resumed the walking. From there, we walked in silence for hours. This time to ourselves was when everything began to take shape for me. So much walking in silence allowed for my mind to offer thousands of explanations of what could possibly be going on, only to eventually settle on the least creative and most obvious realization of the truth. I only managed to get through that day by having my father walking beside me, composed and stern as ever, regardless of the doubtless turmoils he was fighting in his own mind. We only stopped when we came out of the woods to meet a highway. We waited hidden until it was fully dark in order to cross it and resume our walking, which continued long into the early morning hours, when we finally arrived into a farmer house and were offered shelter. Farmers in these regions, some more than others, were used to having armed traffic come through and allowed passing while seemingly looking the other way. No one said much, always an uneasy silence hanging over the group, which the farmer couple adopted instantly. The next day, we were offered a surprisingly large breakfast, surprising only by the circumstances, but not really by the context of where we were. After a coffee resupply, we moved on and got back to walking. This routine kept for a couple of days. We walked, stopped at some house, farm, or ranch, spoke seldomly, and walked again. My father and I spent New Year's Eve holding hands in silence, lying on the floor and holding back our tears, trying to keep our eyes closed and faces straight. By January 3rd, my father managed to hold some conversations with our captors, convincing them that my mother would need help sorting everything out. Being captured, he argued, He was unable to facilitate any negotiation. Eventually, they agreed to release him in order to work something out to get me back. I keep today and cherish fiercely the memory of my father holding me at arm's length, hands on my shoulders. We were nearly the same height, but that day he towered over me. Calm and stern as ever, if only in his demeanor, he looked straight into my eyes and said, "I will come back for you." If today I write these lines, it is only because that statement was true. It wasn't even a promise. I don't think that the words were even meant for me, but rather for himself. He was vocalizing his plan, acknowledging that it was a hard fact. That was all I needed to know. He turned and walked briskly into the foliage. I followed his back until he was gone. What happened next could fill books, and this has run long as is. I was eventually released on mid-June, and for those months I traveled through a spiral of self-discovery that has strongly, but not solely, molded whom I've become. A few thoughts that overarch the whole experience. There was lots of walking involved. We seldom stayed more than 1 or 2 nights at the same place. I think the longest we stayed put during all those months was 5 nights. Walking was a big part of our routine, and one that I appreciated greatly. Never mind that I was always among a group of armed men. While walking, it was just me, my mind, and nature crunching under my boots. I enjoyed being left to my thoughts. Still do. Certainly I learned that the mind can be a man's best friend, or worst enemy. Besides, Colombia's landscape, forests, and rivers are breathtaking. I cannot relate with, only feel terribly compassionate for, all those people who have been held kidnapped in closed quarters, dark spaces. The agony of such circumstances, on top of everything else that these situations imply, is mind-blowing. I slept on a hammock and became very adept at quickly setting it up and bringing it down. We usually slept under the stars, so I also found peace gazing into the night sky and trying to hone my astronomy basics. This wasn't always possible because it rained a lot, so we set up plastic canvases to refuge under. One of my all-time most miserable nights was below a thunderous rainstorm that lasted through the night, shredding whatever we tried to use as shelter. It made me empathetic towards so many people that have nowhere to go when it rains. I was not alone. A few weeks in, our group fused with another that held someone else. It took a while, but eventually they let us connect, and our mutual presence gave each other strength. The other man was very depressed. He was older than me and starting a family, newly wed with a baby on the way. It was a devastating time to find himself in this situation. I eventually managed to make him laugh. We called ourselves roommates, and we became our own little support system. Our only link to the outside world was a little Sony radio that had this cool, retractable wire antenna that could extend for some 4 meters. We hung the antenna on tree branches and managed to hear only 2 stations, a rock radio station and the audio of a national TV channel, of all things. Through this device, we kept on top of news. I remember hearing about Clinton's first inauguration, the rise of Escobar hunting illegal cartels, and the successes of one of Colombia's rising football stars in the Italian League. I owed my sanity to that little radio and the rock station especially, since it was full of these trivial shows and contests that reminded me of the lightness of everyday life. I wrote the station thanking them for their company once I got out. Remember, it was the only station we got. They never responded. We got supplies from market runs, performed around once a month. Someone would leave early and we then rendezvoused in the afternoon at a set place, different from where we separated. They would go into some town and get soap, shampoo, cooking ingredients, batteries, etc. They sometimes allowed us to request small things if they could be easily obtainable. I got some pens and notebooks, a toy chess set, and whatever books they could come across. I read around 8 books total, but nothing too interesting, considering it was just one of these men grabbing whatever he found on some small-town grocery. I remember a couple from Wayne Dyer, not amused, and Kazantzakis' Last Temptation. It was okay. I had my 15th birthday sometime within this period. I celebrated bashfully with my roommate by regarding a giant soursop or guanabana fruit as close a cake as we would get. These are normally melon-sized, so when we found one like a large watermelon, we thought it appropriate for celebrating. We found victories in little things like that all the time. As a present, he gave me an unopened piece of white underwear briefs just arrived from the last supply run. I kid you not when I state just how precious new underwear was, so it was a big deal of a gift. The magic did not last, however, since the very next day, while I wore them for the first time, our group became alerted of some military presence nearby, and we were made to walk extra this day, going non-stop for hours.
Like, comment, and subscribe.